Now let's look at what the demand curve and the supply curve tell us so that we can analyze a market very carefully in looking at something we call consumer surplus and producer surplus. Remember what a demand curve looks like. Our demand curve tells us the relationship between price and quantity when we look at consumers. The demand curve says that if you want to buy a certain quantity, what's the willingness that consumers have to pay for that last unit? So we can look at the willingness to pay of consumers by looking at the demand curve. Willingness to pay is the maximum amount a consumer is willing to pay for a product. So if you go up from the quantity and over, that'll tell you the maximum amount consumers are willing to pay for that last unit. If we look at a different quantity, the law of demand says that consumers are willing to pay more if we're talking about a lower quantity. So again, our demand curves tell us the willingness to pay, or the maximum amount that consumers are willing to pay for a given quantity. Now, consumer surplus is the amount a consumer is willing to pay for a product minus the price the consumer actually has to pay. And so we're going to actually see that consumers tend to benefit when they buy a good or a service, as long as they're willing to pay more than they actually have to pay. How does this work? Well, let's look at this demand curve. This demand curve shows us the number of lawns cut per hour. Right? So our market that we're looking at is lawn mowing. Right? And suppose the equilibrium price of lawn mowing is $10 per lawn. Right? If the price is $10 per lawn, and this demand curve represents different people's willingness to pay, we can look at lawn and see that for the first lawn that's cut, lawn's willing to pay the most. Lawn's willing to pay $22 to get that to happen. Thurl, on the other hand, is willing to pay $16. So Juan values having his lawn cut more than Thurl does. And then Forrest, $13. And if we look at Siggy, Siggy's only willing to pay $7. So if the market price is $10, well then that's more than Siggy's willingness to pay. It's less than Juan's willingness to pay, less than Thurl's, less than Forrest's, less than Tupac's. And it's exactly equal to how much Favola is willing to pay. So if we look at consumer surplus, which we are going to define as the difference between the price that's paid and a consumer's willingness to pay, we can look at Juan. We know that Juan is willing to pay $22, but the price is only $10. So Juan is benefiting by the difference, or $12, between his willingness to pay and the price he actually pays. So this distance between the demand curve and the price is Juan's consumer surplus. We look at Thurl. Thurl's willing to pay $16, but only has to pay $10, so he's benefiting by $6. If we look at Favola, Favola is exactly equal. Willingness to pay and price of $10, so no consumer surplus is generated. Ultimately, we look at this consumer surplus generated in a market as the area underneath the demand curve, but above the price. So it's the area of this triangle right here. Now we can also look at producer surplus. So remember, our supply curve shows us the relationship between price and quantity for suppliers. And if we look at any given quantity, we can go up to the supply curve and over, and that's the minimum amount a producer is willing to accept to produce that unit of the good. So when we're looking at supply curves, we can look at what's called producer surplus, where producer surplus is the price a producer receives minus the marginal cost of production, because the marginal cost of production determines the willingness to accept the minimum price that a producer is going to require to produce that unit of output. How do we show that on a supply curve? Well, in the same way we looked at the lawn mowing industry and the price per lawns and the quantities per lawns, and we were looking at the demand curve, we can do the same along the supply curve. So here's the supply curve, and these are the willingness to accept for different producers. So Abe is willing to mow a lawn for $2, B is willing to mow a lawn for $4, and Cecil's willing to mow a lawn for $6. Ephraim, on the other hand, requires $12. So now suppose the price in the market again is $10. What do we see? Well, we see Eve is breaking even. Eve's willing to mow a lawn at a price of $10 and is getting $10. But Abe is willing to do it for $2. So Abe is collecting a producer surplus of 10 minus 2, or $8, the distance between the supply curve and the price. Cecil is getting $4, 10 minus 6. And D is getting $2 of producer surplus, 10 minus 8. So when we look at producer surplus, it's the area of the triangle underneath the price, but above the supply curve. So it's this triangle right here. We want to get very good at looking at producer surplus and consumer surplus, because when we start looking at interventions in the market, we want to see what happens to producers, what happens to consumers, and if we still get the same outcomes as far as surplus that's generated.